So I hope there is no mic, but I guess you can hear me also. Okay. So thank you very much, Marina and Julia. It's really a great pleasure to be here today and to be able to discuss this paper that I present with you, which is a kind of a very recent thing. I mean, it's a new thing that I'm working on. I absolutely hate this expression, the work in progress. It's an excuse for some, I don't know, things not being fully thought out, but to some extent, I'm sure I will go on with these topics. So the title, as you probably saw it, is Love Your Neighbor as Thyself, interrogation point, exclamation point. And so I will be discussing this question of the neighbor first by a way of very briefly presenting some kind of things that I think are important from the psychoanalytic perspective. I think that there are certain very interesting ways in which Lacan presents or posits this concept of the neighbor. But this will just be a kind of a very brief, like Schnellkurs introduction, and then I will move on and try to also use this more to a kind of concrete examples of political discourse and try to look at the ways in which this figure of the neighbor figures today in certain kind of a very examples of conservative, even alt-right politics. Okay, so I will start with a quote that goes like this. Man tries to satisfy his need for aggression at the expense of his neighbor, to exploit his work without compensation, to use him sexually without his consent, to appropriate his goods, to humiliate him, to inflict suffering on him, to torture and to kill him. So, as some of you probably recognize, this is not Marquis de Sade, it is Freud. It is Freud from Civilization and its Discontents text written in 1930. This is to say right after one big war and just before or another big catastrophe starts. But at the same time, I think we could say that this could easily be written today. I mean, the things that are enumerated are also the things that we seem to be discussing today practically all the time. And this gloomy atmosphere that prevails also is not very foreign to our present climate. So in Freud, this statement is part of his discussion precisely of the biblical commandment to love one's neighbor as thyself. And together with another commandment, namely love thine enemies, which he considered to be the same thing, Freud found it incomprehensible. This is the famous, controversial, if you want, part in Freud. Why should we do it? But above all, how on earth are we to achieve this, particularly if we take the word love seriously, in this kind of a strong meaning of the word? So this is just the Freud's take on it, which is much more elaborate, but and to which, in some ways, Lacan responds in many ways in Ethics of Psychoanalysis. And this is probably one of the extremely rare parts where Lacan is kind of critical of Freud. So I will now just very briefly try to sketch what I think it's a very important aspect of Lacan's intervention into this debate of the neighbor, because it gives us tools with which to think this problem, or at least certain aspects of it today. For Lacan, the neighbor is actually a concept that he elaborates. It's not simply, and it aims precisely at explaining what looks or what seems like this inevitable hostility, aggression that springs up every time we come too close to a neighbor, even in Freud. So this is his idea that why is this so? Why is this structure so sensible? So the term neighbor for him does not simply, it's not a descriptive term. It does not simply refer to the person next door, but is meant to refer or kind of embody the structure that he called extimacy. which is coined upon the word intimacy with this prefix X, which kind of crosses the lines precisely between intimate and foreign or interior, exterior, which is precisely transversal to this divide between outside and inside. So we can also say like coincidence of something most intimate, intrinsic to me, but at the same time exterior and foreign. Something of myself that I cannot recognize but find most foreign to me, even disgusting. So if you want a very good and very plastic example of this structure and of its effects, was provided, as it's often the case, by Žižek, by Slavoj Žižek. Let's say you spit in a clean glass. It would be very hard to make you swallow your saliva back. So it's kind of something that just a second ago was an integral part of you, a most intimate part of you with no problem involved in it. Then in dispatch it somehow is transformed into a foreign object, very foreign of disgusting object, something that does not, it's yours, but it's at the same time not yours. So, and to cut the long story short, we could say that this structure is precisely what for Lacan is at work at the heart of every relationship between the subject and the other, or the others, which precisely is never simply a relationship or this kind of symmetrical mirroring between different egos and reciprocal mirroring and so on, but involves a more complex, vicious dialectics, passing through also this kind of a irreducible dimension of this extimate object, which somehow belongs neither to me nor to the other, but we can kind of incarnate it for each other. But if this structure is always there, it is not always visible. And this injunction to love, or simply love as such, involves precisely going beyond a certain, let's say, imaginary limit that separates me from the other as my fellow creature, or as the good French expression has it, mon semblable, the one who is like me, who is just like the... as I said before, Lacan comments on the love thy neighbor commandment and on Freud's reaction to it quite extensively in the Ethics of Psychoanalysis seminar. And he deems Freud's aversion to it as indicating basically Freud's fundamental belonging still to the Aristotelian conception of the good and of morality. Here he thinks Freud is a little bit, he hasn't read his Kant, let's put it like this. So Freud belongs to this tradition, according to Lacan, precisely because of the way in which he formulated his famous pleasure principle, which is not a principle kind of designating something as active pursuit of pleasure. It's not about hedonism. It's a principle that is kind of governing and regulating our mental events, all mental events, by way of kind of diminishing the tension by way of equilibrium introduced in them. For instance, just a brief quote from Freud. He says, we believe that the course of these events, mental events, is invariably set in motion by an unpleasurable tension, and that it takes a direction such that its final outcome coincides with a lowering of that tension, that is, with an avoidance of unpleasure or a production of pleasure. And actually, when he first introduced it, Freud even named this unpleasure principle. So it's just about kind of avoiding too much tension and trying to stay somewhere like in some more neutral state. And this, for Lacan, rhymes a lot with the way in which Aristotelian morality is constructed. It's a kind of the right measure, it's a kind of equilibrium, and also the pleasure precisely as something that should able us to find the way to the good. He says, for instance, traditional moralist always falls back into the root of persuading us that pleasure is good, that the path leading to good is blazed by pleasure. Okay, but of course Freud also saw in his work, in his practice, that very often the pleasure principle failed at its role, and people were driven to do things that blatantly contradicted it, like, for instance, repeating again and again even clearly unpleasant traumatic experiences and so on. So he was led to interrogate beyond the pleasure principle, hence this other famous essay of his, Beyond the Pleasure Principle, and to some extent at least linking this to a kind of destructive drive, that drive as the opposite of the of the pleasure, this pleasure principle. So this is at least one way in which he can oppose it. But this opposition, I will not go into this, but precisely opposition was hard to sustain already for Freud, and Lacan just rejected it. And so, and I think what is at stake here, very briefly put, is that there seem to be like two possibilities. Either we postulate, as Freud did at some point, that this kind of existence of two competing principles, like sometimes called eros and thanatos, or life drives and death drives, like coexisting in whatever human beings, or else, instead of postulating that the pleasure principle is not all there is to the economic side of our mental life, and hence introducing yet another principle, we simply conclude that the pleasure principle is itself much less straight and unproblematic than it seems to be, or simply that it does not exist in this emphatic way, that simply it unproblematically regulates this. And this is basically, I think, Lacan's step, or Lacan's conclusion, which I think, and here we are coming back to this question of extremity, could be summed up as follows, namely that this beyond against which the pleasure principle seems to protect us is, in fact, its own impossible excluded kernel, something that is precisely predicated upon this impossible thing at its very kernel. So the entire economy of the so-called pleasure principle is based upon this kind of impossible excluded thing at its very core. And that this economy of regulating us around this is also what is at stake in the Aristotelian right measure. So it is at this, you probably know, at this precisely extimate place of the thing, which Lacan in this seminar speaks about the thing. Later on, this becomes a very much smaller object, small a, but it is here that Lacan situates enjoyment, this jouissance, in this more emphatic sense of the word, precisely at this point of extremity. Enjoyment is what kind of seems to keep haunting us from the space of the other. It usually strikes us as foreign enjoyment if we kind of detect it, and it gives rise to aggressivity. And perhaps, and this is kind of an interesting hypothesis that perhaps we should also consider, we could say that we perceive that what kind of intrudes upon us from the space of the other as enjoyment, precisely. You know, not to say, okay, there is enjoyment and so we hate it, but that there is something of this trespassing the limit between this imaginary limit between myself and the other that produces precisely this effect of enjoyment. The other is enjoying. And you know, you have plenty of examples from, you know, I don't know, if you have neighbors who enjoy some other kind of ethnic cuisines, what can bother you is the smell of their food because they are enjoying in a different way, or or smokers in general seem to be, the smoke is very, it's a kind of a, it's something that kind of trespasses or intrudes, seems to intrude upon you from the space of the other, registers precisely as his or her enjoyment. And of course, his or her enjoyment that is there more or less on your account, or on the account of your enjoyment. Anyway, all this to say that this kind of aggressivity that kind of springs up here does not simply originate in some kind of other dark principle of death or whatever, but is precisely the other side of the pleasure principle. It is this kind of its own defense formation, its own contradiction, its own inherent contradiction. Okay, just a few more minutes of this introduction. So Lacan also points out how Freud, in his reading of the Love Thy Neighbor commandment, put strong emphasis on the term love, precisely, which is that what in the commandment at stake breaks the fence or breaks defense, separating us from this kind of beyond, from this evil. The fence, and Lacan also speaks of the wall erected by the pleasure principle and regulated by it, or if one prefers this way of putting it, by this kind of traditional Aristotelian conception of the good, which has to repress something in order for it to function. And it is here that this is the question of the neighbor, also with its Christian tradition, comes in, namely the injunction to love him. The neighbor gives body precisely to this beyond. And this raises the question of the fundamental evil that dwells within the neighbor. But this is kind of Lacan's coup de force. If this is the case, then it also dwells within me. And what is more, this is a quote, what is more of a neighbor to me than this heart within which is that of my jouissance and which I don't dare go near? For as soon as I go near it, there rises up the unfathomable aggressivity from which I flee. Okay, so in other words, it is structurally unclear or uncertain whether this excluded kernel of my being is indeed mine or others. And if the other seems to possess it, I cannot remain indifferent to her. I can either love her or hate her, which at some level is not all that different. You know, this is why, again, a famous quote from Lacan, the Seminar 11, when he has this very nice paraphrasing of what can happen in love. And he says, I love you, but since inexplicably I love in you something more than you, this treasure, this objectia, I mutilate you. So, you know, it's you can function as an envelope precisely of this object that fascinates me, but you as you are kind of dispensable here. Okay, so this was just to set a little bit of mapping regarding Lacan's concept of neighbor as related to this extimacy structure and also jouissance, but I don't want at all, and I hope this will be more clear after this central part, involve any kind of psychology here. I really would like to keep this jouissance as something that is an effect of a certain structure. So it's not, I'm not trying to psycholize people who kind of hate their neighbors because they cannot bear their own jouissance. I mean, it's really, I would really like to keep this as a question of structure. And concrete also political examples, I think, will perhaps help us to do this precisely. So I will now move to jump from psychoanalysis to a very different source or sources, namely to the way in which the commandment to love one's neighbor is commented in contemporary, whatever, Western conservative politics, from moderate conservative to the extreme right wing. So this politics obviously has a problem with the commandment at stake, because on the one hand, it has to somehow endorse it, since a crucial element of its discourse is the reference to Christianity as the core of our Western identity. This is basically how it's presented. Christianity is our identity. On the other hand, this commandment is felt as possibly ceding far too much to the neighbor as our other, and hence as a serious threat to this same identity. So if we kind of go too far there, then we risk precisely this why we claim the Christianity for. And this, of course, became particularly palpable and explicit with the 2015 refugee crisis. And I will now give you a very, I think, eloquent and nice example. namely when in October 2015, Tony Abbott, the Prime Minister of Australia at that time, delivered the so-called Margaret Thatcher lecture in London. He said, among other things, the following. He said, "The safety and prosperity that exists almost uniquely in Western countries is an irresistible magnet. These blessings are not the accidents of history, but the product of values painstakingly discerned and refined, and of practices carefully cultivated and reinforced over hundreds of years. Implicitly or explicitly, the imperative to love your neighbor as you love yourself is at the heart of every Western polity. It expresses itself in laws protecting workers, in strong social security safety nets, and in the readiness to take in refugees. It is what makes us decent and humane countries, as well as prosperous ones. But," then now comes the famous but that we were all waiting for, "but right now, this wholesome instinct is leading much of Europe into catastrophic error. Right now, this wholesome instinct is leading much of Europe into catastrophic error. No country or continent can open its borders to all comers without fundamentally weakening itself. This is the risk that the countries of Europe now run through misguided altruism." End of quote. So before we attempt to kind of follow the meanders of this argument, I think it's only fair to mention that Tony Abbott's speech was actually met in the Australian media with, as one defender of Abbott put it, an unanimous chorus of jeers and condemnation. Christian commentators objected that Jesus' command to love our neighbor is at the heart of Christian morality, and we cannot simply set it aside when it happens to be costly or inconvenient. Catholic priests stated that they were absolutely astounded and appalled by Abbott's remarks. And on social media, the following post on Facebook allegedly summed up the general feeling. So the post was, "He, that is Abbott, is so going to hell." So I think this is not bad as a reaction, like a spontaneous reaction in Australia, if this is true. But in Christian Europe, this Christian sentiment did not prevail. And particularly the self-proclaimed precisely Christian politicians rather took recourse to, as we all know, closing the borders, building walls or barbed wire fences, and to implementing a severe, why not put it like this, screw the neighbor legislation. So what exactly did Abbott preach in London, if we now look a little bit closer to this quote? He did not reject Christian commandment to love your neighbor, which he recognized at the very heart of every Western polity, but preached a moderate, reasonable, modest usage of this commandment. Of course, you should love your neighbor, but reasonably, not too much, not too many, not beyond a certain limit. In other words, we could say that he called for the, let's say, properly Christian or this radically Christian ethics to cede its place to the Aristotelian ethics of moderation and of the right measure. Pagan ethics, or to put it in a different and probably more succinct kind of formula, I would put it like this. He called for love to be substituted by altruism or philanthropy. And I think, of course, we can already see this clearly if we jump back to Freud for just a moment. Namely, Freud, of course, was not religious, but he saw immediately that to love your neighbor beyond reciprocity and beyond the limit of convenience and of a pleasurable exchange was the whole point of this commandment. This is why he had certain problems with it, but this is precisely the point. And this whole point is precisely what Abbott designates now as misguided altruism, which, by the way, I think it's a very interesting definition of love. Love is a misguided altruism. It is altruism turning askew, you just kind of... Now, even if perhaps not visible at a first sight, this move is something, from love to altruism, is something that rhymes, I think, profoundly with kind of capitalist market economy and ideology. Of course, already the emphasis on philanthropy and humanitarian projects is itself not anecdotal in capitalist discourse. This is very much how it operates as well. But I'm referring here more specifically to the logic that governs the field of, let's say, goods as commodities and precisely their association with the good also in the moral sense. Now, let me just briefly explain this. You know that Jeremy Bentham formulated his famous principle of utility as promoting the greatest good for the greatest number. And this principle has been and still is often criticized as something that does not really work because it inevitably comes up against the demands of my egoism. So one says, for instance, psychological egoism rules out acting to promote the overall well-being when it is incompatible with one's own. But I think this is a very incisive point that Lacan makes also in the Ethics of Psychoanalysis. He says that this objection to Bentham is actually misplaced and completely insufficient, that this is not the problem. He says, I quote, "My egoism is quite content with a certain altruism. Altruism of the kind that is situated on the level of the useful." And this term useful is very important, I think. "It is a fact of experience," this is still the quote, "that what I want is the good of others in the image of my own. That does not cost much. What I want is the good of others, provided that it remain in the image of my own." Okay, so the point here is simply that altruism and egoism combine without the problem. So sometimes it is, I think this is a good point to remember when we sometimes, I think, too easily just accuse, let's say, a capitalist ideology as simply egoistic. It is egoistic, but not without precisely counting on a certain dimension of altruism that sustains it, actually. Altruism and egoism combine without a problem so far as we are in the realm of good. So the limit of my good is not simply the good of the other or the others, but it is more, and this is again a quote from Lacan, it is the nature of the good, in the nature of the good to be altruistic. But this is not the love of thy neighbor. So here we come back precisely to this difference, interesting difference between altruism as finally completely compatible with the field of goods, and love as situated beyond a certain limit of the calculus of good, precisely, of pleasure and also of reciprocity. And I will now give you a very colorful explication, perhaps, of this difference. It's also a quote from Lacan, a quote that would probably in these times demand a trigger warning for the last part of it, but I will just give you the quote. He says, "As long as it's the question of the good, there is no problem. Our own and our neighbors are of the same material. San Martin shares his cloak." This refers to the famous biblical story when San Martin shares his cloak with a naked beggar. "And a great deal is made of it. Yet it is after all a simple question of training. Material is by its very nature made to be disposed of. It belongs to the other as much as it belongs to me. We are no doubt touching a primitive requirement in the need to be satisfied here, for the beggar is naked. But perhaps over and above the need to be clothed, he was begging for something else, namely that San Martin either kill him or fuck him. In any encounter, there is a big difference in meaning between the response of philanthropy and that of love." End of quote. Okay, so I think perhaps first just a remark which is perhaps necessary in relationship to this kill him or fuck him part. Namely, I think we should be careful not simply to take these two examples as designating a kind of objective limit with, on the one side, like pre-established list of things that can be shared or exchanged, and on the other side, lists of things that cannot. This is never simply pre-established. Although this difference, this dividing line is certainly and structurally operative, it exists, things can pass from one side to the other following all sorts of conditions in concrete, like historical, cultural, economic, social circumstances. So I think when Lacan says, imagine that he would ask you to kill him or fuck him, I think he's doing actually two things at the same time. Yes, first he's choosing a kind of a received striking example of the difference or the limit between, let's say, this pleasure principle and a possible beyond. And secondly, and perhaps more importantly, he's signifying or saying that this limit, which exists, whenever and wherever it happens to appear, is precisely the point when the structure of fantasy, this our fantasy, kicks in. And fantasy, I mean here is in kind of psychoanalytic way, not simply as a kind of whatever fabrication, but the fantasy with which we frame a certain reality. And just to give you an example, I mean, what I mean by this, that the fantasy kicks in precisely at that point. For instance, we can say that it could be factually true that, I don't know, Muslim culture has a different idea of manhood and womanhood than Christian culture. But when we start imagining what these Muslims would do to our women, the structure of fantasy, of our fantasy, is fully operative. Which is to say that it is precisely our jouissance that we keep at bay with these fantasies. So this is precisely the way how to try to keep some distance here when the things come too close precisely to ourselves. So, but anyway, okay, this is just a comment on this part. But so, as I said before, capitalist discourse, in spite of its obvious accent on individualism and egoism, is not simply in contradiction with a certain kind of altruism. And this is also why basically this is how injustices and suffering are supposed to be dealt with. What is good here? Good is something that can be divided, distributed, exchanged. And our society, or rather our economy, brought this to its peak, of course. Good is everything that subscribes in principle to the universal equivalent. This is the definition of the structure of the good, but also of the good. And I'm not trying to indulge here in kind of a cheap moralizing criticism of our times. I really mean this as this definition is a kind of a strict philosophical, logical sense of the word. It is in the nature of the good to subscribe to a general equivalent. Otherwise, it is not good. But love, and that's a wholly different matter. And therefore, one of the consequences here is precisely that love is not a good, exactly. And I think, again, that the way in which love, in this kind of a more emphatic sense, is more and more seen as more problematic in contemporary whatever ideology. It is precisely something that is supposed to be, that brings with itself all kinds of dangers, of trespassing or going beyond a certain limit, of sharing of reciprocity and so on. So it is not a good. It is something that needs all the more to be regulated. Okay, but let us now return to Tony Abbott's speech. I would like to suggest that, in fact, he is quite right when he claims that the commandment to love your neighbor expresses itself in laws protecting workers, in strong social security safety nets, and in the readiness to take in refugees. What is bizarre about this claim is that what he is describing here is, of course, usually associated with the politics of the left and criticized as such by the conservative right to which he belongs. Liberal Party of Australia that Abbott led at the time of his speech is a central right conservative liberal party. Moreover, the fact that the quote is from his Margaret Thatcher lecture cannot but strike us as doubly perverse. And as a matter of fact, Thatcher turns out to be a very good lead when it comes to researching the destiny of the neighbor in conservative liberal politics. Namely, in the passage from this famous interview from 1987, in which she launched this equally famous and famous thesis that there is no such thing as society. The interview, which was also a pretty frontal attack precisely on laws protecting workers and particularly on strong social security safety nets, actually the word neighbor appears twice. It's really interesting to look at this famous passage from the perspective of the question of the neighbor. So I will now give you Margaret Thatcher and this famous passage about there is no such thing as society. I quote her. People are casting their problems on society, and who is society? There is no such thing. There are individual men and women, and there are families, and no government can do anything except through people, and people look to themselves first. It is our duty to look after ourselves and then also to help look after our neighbor. And life is a reciprocal business, and people have got the entitlements too much in mind without the obligations, because there is no such thing as an entitlement unless someone has first met an obligation. And it is, I think, one of the tragedies in which many of the benefits we give, which were meant to reassure people that if they were sick or ill, there was a safety net and there was help. That was the objective, but somehow there are some people who have been manipulating the system, and so some of those help and benefits that were meant to say to people, all right, if you cannot get a job, you shall have a basic standard of living. But then people come and say, but what is the point of working? I can get as much on the dole. You say, look, it is not from the dole, it is your neighbor who is supplying it. End of quote. Okay, so I think here there are many things that one can say about this passage. So the neighbor appears first, this at the beginning, in this kind of a strangely shameless reversal of the biblical commandment, considering that the lines come from a devoted Christian, okay, Methodist Christian, but Christian, when she says it is our duty to look after ourselves and then also to help look after our neighbor. In fact, it reminds me, of these instructions that you get in the airplanes. If the oxygen mask falls down, you first help yourself and then assist the others. So, and the commandment is clearly said for her, it's about reciprocity. And the fact that this commandment does present her with a confusing problem was openly admitted by Thatcher on another occasion. This was 1 year later in a speech she gave in Scotland. This is a much briefer quote, where she said, I confess that I always had difficulty with interpreting the biblical precept to love our neighbors as ourselves, until I read some of the words of C.S. Lewis. He pointed out that we don't exactly love ourselves when we fall below the standards and beliefs we have accepted. Indeed, we might even hate ourselves for some unworthy deed. You see, I think this is a very interesting approach at interpreting the commandment at stake. Namely, according to this interpretation, the commandment doesn't imply that we should always love our neighbor or simply love her unconditionally. Indeed, where does this commandment leave me if I happen to hate myself most of the time? Of course, this would be a valid question, possibly leading to the question of my hatred of my jouissance, but we can see from the way this functions in this speech that this question is not even seriously asked, let alone answered, addressed, but merely used to relativize the commandment. So to supply a justification for not taking it seriously, for not obeying it. We don't always love ourselves, obviously, and hence we don't always need to love our neighbor. So it's as simple as that. Of course, we shall love our neighbor, but there is a limit to it. This is again this mantra. Of course, we should love our neighbor, but we should first and foremost take care of ourselves and our family. And of course, neighbor and family are two very different structures of proximity. It's not at all the same thing. Okay, so this is this first instance, and then the neighbor reappears at the end of the Thatcher quote, this time as an abused neighbor. Now, if you are on the dole, you are effectively stealing from your neighbor. Or put the other way around, people on the dole are bad neighbors, parasitic neighbors. Like society, the dole does not really exist. It is a term, institution, ideology that, for Thatcher, mispresents the actual relation between people. You could put it like this. So Thatcher's attack on the welfare state was also, and perhaps primarily, an attack on something else, namely precisely on love and solidarity among neighbors as a social form, which precisely does not depend on our whims and individuals directly. It's a social form, and as based precisely on social or symbolic mediation. Let's say welfare state or this kind of institutional solidarity is, I think, among other things, a kind of depersonalized love for one's neighbor. And perhaps this, in this deeply Christian sense, the love for one's neighbor is always, to some extent, depersonalized, that it has this kind of precisely, it's the one which is the further from me that I really love. So it is a kind of delegated love with many, I think, social advantages that come with this delegation in the case of the welfare state. So we could also put it like this: the dole is there precisely so that I don't need to love my neighbor, and the accent is in this negation is on I, not on love. So it doesn't so much depend on my feelings, as the feeling of love itself is part of the social infrastructure. So it is a delegation of this love to social infrastructure. So we could say welfare state loves your neighbor for you. And if I insist on the term love here, it is because I think in many respects what was welfare state kind of stretches beyond reciprocity. Precisely, it's not this kind of structure. It exists as something that transcends simply altruism or mirroring of my own good in the image of my neighbors and so on. It's in this sense, I would say dole is not so much a safety net as it is an interface. And Thatcher's kind of nominalist maneuver here was precisely out to repersonalize the dole, to repersonalize it just enough for the people to see or to recognize a neighbor in it. Dole. Dole, or like is there what would be? So to recognize a neighbor in it. Of course, a neighbor kind of shamelessly enjoying on their account. Let's put a face on the dole. Or how does the dole with a human face look like? Well, it looks like an evil neighbor. But of course, this is only part of this whatever liberal, neoliberal story. This is what people who have jobs and are not on the dole or any other social benefits should feel. This is here, it's all about feeling. It's all very personal. On the other side, let's say on the side of the receivers, it's a very different story. No question of getting personal here. On the contrary, is purely and extremely non-personal bureaucratic net makes it sure that you don't get to talk meaningfully to any person. I suppose most of you have seen Ken Loach's movie I, Daniel Blake, which kind of, I think, is a brilliant rendering precisely of this. If you really need the dole, you are presented with an impenetrable bureaucratic procedures and incomprehensible gibber deprived of all kind of human feeling and common sense. All there, of course, to prevent abuse, so-called. That is to protect, we could put it also this way, to protect those who work from you, who are on the dole. In other words, it is a safety net, but a safety net protecting those who don't particularly need protection. But I think these two aspects, this highly personalized, like though it's concretely, directly my neighbor who is squeezing or enjoying on my account, and this kind of a completely unpenetrable network are two sides of the same logic, and just one, I think this kind of wall like this that is easily penetrable, like transparent, as if non-existent from the one side, and at the same time utterly impenetrable from the other side, is perhaps a kind of a very most salient topological figure of our time, of the functioning precisely of late capitalism on many levels. And I think this image, it's a kind of captivating image that was there, if you remember, in the first Blade Runner movie, when this final chase between this replicant and Harrison Ford as a human. There is this very nice scene in this deserted building. They are on different sides of the same wall, and so the replicant has no problem just crashing the wall and getting to the other side, whereas Harrison Ford is completely kind of impotent on the other side. He cannot do anything with this wall. Okay, anyway, so what I'm trying to get out to now is that would be the following point, namely that the capitalist economy and its form of value, that in the capitalist economy and its form of value, proximity is not simply the opposite of alienation, but it's rather its form. And that in our, let's say, social economic order, the place of maximum proximity is not, say, the neighborhood, but actually the market, now the global market. It is there that our most intimate and precious possession, our value, our labor force as value, mingles shamelessly with other people's intimate possessions, compares to them, competes with them, gets exchanged with them. And this is not, there is no bodily proximity, it is a proximity of our value, even of our surplus value. And I think this is precisely why Lacan could predict, and this was back in 1967 already, he said our future as common markets will be balanced by an increasingly hardline extension of the process of segregation, which was, I think, a really prophetic statement at the time. Because market is the place of, let's say, compulsorily, if alienated proximity. It has often been pointed out that whereas globalization is all about the mobility of the capital, it is much less about mobility of the people. But I think we need to be a little bit more precise here and add that this is not simply the opposition here, it's not simply that between capital and people, but rather between people and something in people more than people, precisely our value as labor force, with the latter being situated outside ourselves, on the side of the capital, its accumulation, its global circulation, and hence subjected, obviously, to its radical abstraction. So it's like the division is really not simply between people and capital, but with between people and something in people more than people, which is integral part of the circulation of the capital. And I think this is also, we could say that many today's this kind of nationalist and identitarian movements are a response to this kind of radical abstraction of the capital. There are attempts to kind of find our surplus value somewhere else, in our bodies or in our national identity, something that kind of makes us more unique. And although the ultimate goal is what? We find our surplus value so that we can sell our nation better on the global market. But basically, so it's there is no way to escape here. But this, and I will be talking a little bit about this, the notion of value, and which is the same word, and of values in the sense of traditional values or national values and so on. There is no coincidence that it's the same word, and they very much combine in this present configuration. And of course, it is also this kind of radical abstraction as the form of value that I think accounts for, on the other hand, this extreme sensitivity to the bodies of the other, to other bodies which always strike us as too full of everything, as too menacing kind of response. Precisely, it's kind of again, it's kind of artificial division or separation between this fully abstract level and this kind of concrete thing finding its way back in this kind of a two-fullness of jouissance of the bodies of the other bodies. So and everything that is not in this sense completely abstract appears as a foreign jouissance. And in this sense, precisely, I would repeat what I said before, that we should perhaps understand jouissance precisely as an effect of this structure, and not simply as something existing somewhere outside it. Okay, so the growing sense, let's say, among the people that they are worth nothing or very little, I think it's precisely directly, of course, dependent on the capitalist ontology in which being is value. We are reduced to nothing but value, and I think we should stop to think precisely about this seeming paradox. We think we are so much into it that we directly and spontaneously understand this as something good. If we are of value, this is something good. But already Marx had this line that to be, let's say, the producer of value is not a blessing, but it is a curse. So it is the whole question of value is precisely the way in which we are very much deprived of, if you would, any value. So here I'm not sure what is the time, because I'm now. I can make this very short because I have a part which is not essential, but which would be more extended, where I introduce a little bit this notion that I think it's very interesting, on which David Harvey, the Marxist, works a lot in his recent writings, namely the notion of the anti-value or non-value as a kind of a intrinsic and a very important part of precisely of the whole dialectics of value as Marx formulated it. But I will perhaps simply jump to the conclusion, and then in this sense we can perhaps have more time for the debate. I don't know, or because it's.
I'd be interested to hear you talk about the anti-value.
Okay, then I will just briefly, because I think there is an interesting also parallel that one can get here between precisely Marxism and psychoanalysis to some extent. So as you know, perhaps in his recent work, David Harvey has proposed this kind of a very elaborate reading of the Marxist theory of value. Some of it is not published yet, I guess. And also of Marx's this infamous labor theory of value. He also formulated a very important thesis according to which value in Marx's analysis is constituted as precisely a dialectics between value and anti-value or non-value, and is on many different points or levels. For instance, whenever capital takes on a particular form, as a production process, as a product waiting to be sold, as money waiting to be transferred or reinvested, the capital is virtually devalued. Capital lying at rest in any of these states is variously termed like negated, false, dormant, fixated. If it remains frozen in its form, in the form, let's say, of the finished product, it can not be active as capital. It has value only when it circulates. But then also it circulates also within this dialectics precisely of transforming or integrating non-value into value. So the point, I guess, that Harvey is making is this double point that anti-value signals, of course, the potential for breakdown in the continuity of capital, and of course non-productive labor is also a case of non-value. But at the same time, and also as already Marx knew, this kind of crisis that related to non-value as well, do not necessarily spell the end of capitalism, but can set the stage precisely for its renewal, for kind of a revolutionary reappropriation or adaptation of some non-value into value. And here we see that this kind of dialectical role of anti-value in the reproduction of the capital. But at the same time, the constitution of capital is insecure and has limits. So it's there is this, one could put it like this: on the one hand, non-value or anti-value can constitute a crisis as precisely this kind of productive, propelling point of capitalism. But on the other hand, it is also the point where the latter is most vulnerable. It can collapse under the dead weight of anti-value. So anti-value, this has signals the potential breakdown in the continuity of capital circulation. And it is actually on this basis that Harvey dismisses this. I know it's kind of a controversial point. He dismisses precisely the political relevance of the appeals to include non-productive labor as non-value, for example, domestic labor, into value production. He says, this is a quote from Harvey, granting wages for housework simply reassures us that household labor can in principle be integrated into the capitalist mode of production. There have been parallel movements to integrate the free gifts of nature into the stream of value production by some arbitrary valuation devices proposed by environmental economists. This, he says, amounts to nothing more than a sophisticated greenwashing and commodification of a space from which a fierce attack upon the hegemony of the capitalist mode of production and our alienated relation to nature can be mounted. Okay, so you see the point here is that if there is a possible counterattack on capitalism, it cannot come simply from including more and more things, like, for instance, domestic labor in the capitalist form of value, but rather from a kind of systematic and organized affirmation of non-value, that is, of organizing exchange and production in another way, outside this capitalist form of value. So not from exempting some things from capital-related valorization, but precisely by questioning this form itself and constructing, like socially constructing an alternative form. So this is Harvey, and I won't go into what, if and how is this possible. What I would like to suggest or say in this last part is simply that there are, I think, some interesting parallels between Harvey's, or let's say Marxian notion of this non-value or anti-value and what Lacan called jouissance. We could even say perhaps that jouissance is a psychoanalytic concept of anti-value. For instance, you have this famous definition from Encore, which is jouissance is what serves no purpose. And Marx, the concluding part of the first chapter of Capital, he says nothing can be of value without being an object of utility. If a thing is useless, so is the labor contained in it. The labor does not count as labor and therefore creates no value. So there is this kind of a interesting way in which, through the question of utility and value and how it could be turned into value, the two are kind of situated on a similar level. And of course, like the Marxian notion or Marxian non or anti-value, this jouissance can also be, and de facto was, integrated, pulled into the economy and dialectics of valorization. Not only valorization of affect, it's a whole economy, and which is one of the reasons, I think, for which Lacan's coming up with the term surplus jouissance. You know, this is something that he coined directly upon the Marxian notion of surplus value. So it's quite explicit. So if on the one hand we can say enjoyment, jouissance is what serves no purpose and does not count, it can very much be caught up in the discourse as the very source of value, of some value, of the very way in which to extract more and more out of us. in a kind of similar way to this Marxist dialectic of value and anti-value. And for Lacan, this is very much an historic occurrence, which he relates also directly, this is in the seminar, The Other Side of Psychoanalysis, to what he calls their capitalist discourse, or the social bond. He says, just two brief quotes, he says, the important point is that on a certain day, surplus jouissance became calculable, could be counted, totalized. This is where the accumulation of the capital begins. So precisely this kind of non-productive something, it becomes cashed in as the very surplus of value. Or the other quote, the secret of the worker himself is to be reduced to being no longer anything but value. Surplus jouissance is no longer surplus jouissance, but it's inscribed simply as value, to be inscribed or deduced from the totality of whatever is that is accumulating. Okay, so you see, this is just a sketchy presentation, but very much like the transformation of anti-value into value in Harvey, its capitalization, the things are of a similar structure here. We could say surplus value is non-value that counts. And of course, when we say non-value, it doesn't mean that this is something insignificant. It means that it doesn't count as value within this value form. And then somehow it starts to count. And it is this permutation that generates new surplus value. And capital progresses by including more and more things in the realm of value precisely and its countability. It is moving in this direction. Okay, so let me just briefly ask in the conclusion, what do we gain by this co-staging of, let's say, jouissance and anti-value, or psychoanalysis and Marxism? For an orthodox Marxist, this can sound as an attempt to inscribe the kind of Marxist historical theory within a certain eternal psychology of the human, which is not at all what I'm suggesting. And also, as you saw, Lacan points this to a certain historical point, not to some kind of psychological given thing. So what I'm suggesting is simply two things, or perhaps three. First is that libidinal and social economies are far from being simply unrelated. But then, second point, I think probably the most important, I think psychoanalysis can help us understand a very important structural topological feature precisely of the global market. It's being this universal point precisely of our extimacy today. It is not simply inside nor outside. We sweat and spit into this pot, and what we get back often looks sordid and impossible to swallow. Yet it is us, it is our value, no doubt about it. And of course, neighbors, the figure of the neighbor here, the new immigrant, refugees, whatever, functions today precisely as a kind of embodiment, as the face of this extimate point of global market. And I think this even empirically can be seen in certain parts of Europe, that refugees were really seen as agent of globalization, not as some kind of bizarre ethnicity penetrating this other nation state, but precisely as someone on account of whom, for instance, except for here where this is normal, English became a kind of official language. In Germany, many people complain that now everything is becoming like international, and there is something that globalization was brought by these people, not some kind of bizarre rituals. I mean, of course, these fantasies exist as well, but like in general, that the country is losing its identity to some kind of indefined global non-national state. So, but it's precisely, we need this face, this neighbor, in order to kind of, I would say, not see this extimate point of intimacy that is actually nothing else but the market. And I think that also we could perhaps put it like this: I do not hate this neighbor because, or neighbors because they are so different. I think this kind of cultural differences today more like the fantasy handy prop that precisely masks a much more disturbing sameness, which is the true problem. This picture has differences. It makes it possible for me precisely not to see or to grasp what I can, as a worker, nevertheless feel deeply in my bones. That precisely the worthless piece of shit out there is in fact me. And I think it is here that we perhaps should find a way to kind of rebel against this. Okay, this is all that I have.
So, are there any immediate questions while I work on formulating some? Yep.
So you said at the end, this is where we need to rebel. Could you
Yeah.
Expand on that a bit? What does that mean?
Yeah, I think it's there is a. I mean, the whole argument that I tried to present is precisely goes in this direction, or of how to break out of this complete closure into the system of that functions as a form of value. So what would be, I mean, okay, there are examples, you know, how people organize. I'm not idealizing this or thinking it, but there are ways of communities of organizing which are precisely not based on this kind of value exchange, and where precisely, I think one way to go about it, but this remains abstract, is precisely to refuse to be of value. I mean, this is not simply done, of course. I mean, our survival depends on it. I'm not kind of trying to suggest some kind of heroic, but this kind of dismantle a little bit this immediacy or immediate positive connotation of the word value as it functions like in this more cultural, ideological field is, I think, important part of this, that it's precisely why, I mean, there are some other ways perhaps through which we could construct our relationships and interests for each other than this. But obviously, I mean, this is, if the question is, what should we do to, I mean, I don't have a recipe, but it is, I mean, I don't know, it just strikes me that there is something precisely because this whole ideology also, which is kind of supposedly also sometimes presents itself as anti-capitalist, you know, this kind of, let's go back to traditional values and for kind of close ourselves within nation states and try to kind of live in a, but the way it functions is, it's not at all, it doesn't at all escape the logic of the market. Is, as I said before, is just a way of selling your nation better on the global market. And this is very often, I think this is also part of the Brexit campaign. I mean, that it's not about simply being, it is having a more of a force of competition on the global market. So it's so this the values, the way in which the very term value functions today is to be kind of carefully scrutinized. And also, for instance, if you take university systems, where in some countries or in some languages you also have, within education, you have, you know, for instance, in France, if there what you call, I think here, credits, which also resonates with this, they call unité de valeur, unity of value. Students have to, you know, it's there are so many levels on which this is really kind of caught into this production of value that it's, but yes, of course, that what would be the way of dismantle precisely this, and how to kind of reclaim space of non-utility for purposes that are, of course, very much so purpose of like, yeah, if you want, sharing something or constituting some bonds within, but in another way. But yeah, I don't have yeah, a recipe or response more. Either, yeah, there are two hands. I'm not sure who.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. That's super interesting. I wanted to ask you if you could clarify, because I was a little bit confused about the understanding of love in by Neighbour. So it seems to me that sometimes you speak about the love stuff as an exception. So it kind of resonates this idea of like, I love you, but I don't love Amy, I don't love Joe, I love you. And that's an exception, and it seems it works because it's an exception to this universal thing that is happening right now. It's capitalism, globalization, so it's cool. But on the other hand, you sometimes talk about this as like exception being a bad thing because that creates identitarian politics and nationalism, and creates a distinction between a neighbor I love and a stranger who I don't love. So this seems to be kind of like a more universal thing. Everyone is a neighbor. So I'm a bit confused about whether it's a particular thing or a universal thing.
No, thank you very much for this question. I think it will allow me to clarify this point and also perhaps to provide a slightly more interesting or additional answer to the previous question. Yeah, I think first of all, there is, I don't think love, although there is of course this image that with love that it's something exclusive, let's say, if it's not exceptional, exclusive. But this is, I think, precisely not what is at stake here. And there is, I don't think love in this sense, like in which also Lacan interprets it via this commandment, is based on exception. It is different, it obeys a different logic from this universal, which is of, let's say, good, which is constituted precisely on the basis of an exception. It is this logic of universal that needs to be grounded on an exception. Whereas, let's say, the form of love is precisely something that knows no limit in this sense. I mean, for those who come from Lacanian background, I could just simply use the word not all. It's something that precisely, it's not a whole that constitutes itself through excluding something, but it is something that is inclusive in the sense that precisely it is non-all because it does not have a limit, an exception. So this is in the fact that if you, this idea or whatever, to love your neighbor is precisely not to love beyond a certain limit, but precisely to say there is no limit to this. It is not, and so, and I think in this sense, of course, I mean, this is a kind of a risky or daring hypothesis, but I think it is a way of thinking precisely of another social bond, let's say, which would be, and this perhaps would be another possible answer to the previous question, that of course I was kind of hinting a little bit in this direction. What would be love as social bond? It's precisely not based on this kind of exchange of goods and exception that then comes back again and again in this form of exclusion and hatred, but which would be something else, and which is precisely not simply loving this, I don't know how to put it like this, it's kind of a cheap bourgeois sense, like I can only love this exclusion, but precisely something that goes beyond this kind of simple reciprocity in this sense. No? So, but how to, I mean, obviously Lacan has had this idea that the analytic discourse was precisely would be such a social bond, but he also said quite explicitly that this is no progress if it only happens for some. I mean, this is so it needs to have a social infrastructure precisely. This was slightly the direction to which I went with this interpretation of the Dole as possibly social infrastructure of love, but which obviously also has its limits. And I don't think that nowadays simply trying to conserve this is leading very far, because I think conservation of welfare state is a kind of a lost battle in this at this point of advance of capitalism, because what is happening is that the ones, and we see this also among the supporters of these radical nationalist ideas, that the poorest are doing the work for the elite. I mean, the idea is that they're, I mean, within the precarity and everything, welfare state benefits really appear to people, and I mean normally so, as privileges. It's not so. It's very easy to just. I mean, people are outraged that there are certain privileges that are not accessible to them, and so the dynamics is very sinister, because it is the dynamic such. And I think this was clear in the election of Trump, that lots of his bases were really like poor workers who kind of who did not recognize themselves in any possible social benefit or whatever. So doing the work for precisely something that just has nothing to do with their cause, but nevertheless. So yeah, so it's not. I wouldn't here put love on the side of the logic of exception, but precisely try to construct it through this other logic, which Lacan calls the non-all, and which is which one way of defining it is precisely that the exception is included, that it's not you have this famous joke, there are no cannibals here anymore. We ate the last one yesterday, which is a kind of a good example of how you constitute a whole bit by way of an exception precisely. But this would be some other logic, yeah. Yes.